national interest and the United States. And our guest is a extraordinarily well-known authority on Germany. He holds a academic post from which he's on long-term leave. He is the director of the Research Institute for International Affairs at Ebenhausen, which is an equivalent of our RAND Corporation, at least the international affairs part of the RAND Corporation. He is by profession a historian, an academician. He's well published. Interestingly, one of his last three works is on the Oppenheimer family, a banking family in Köln. But two of the last three books have been on German history and German affairs. One looking at the long period of the 19th century and going through World War I, which examines the limits of power under the name of the book being The Restless Empire, and deals with these questions of understanding the limits of power, which our Mr. Kissinger and Germany's Mr. Kissinger in many ways had looked at with respect to Bismarck in particular. The Limits of Power, the third book that Professor Stuermer has written recently, examines the present and looks forward, focusing on that same theme. This is not Professor Stuermer's first trip to the United States. Certainly, he's been here many times. He's had an affiliation with Johns Hopkins at SAIS and overseas at the Bologna campus. He has been a visiting professor at the University of Toronto, the Sorbonne. He's been a research fellow earlier in his career at Harvard. He's been at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. He, in short, is one of the world's senior authorities on international affairs. I might add that he's a member of the Legion of Honor, a high and very distinctive French award. He also has a column which he publishes for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung and another for the Daily Record. So he's an academic of considerable renown and is well known in Europe through his columns. The topic is fascinating. Our speaker is sound. We look forward to a most interesting evening. It's my pleasure to present to you Professor Dr. Stuermer.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your kind introduction and the invitation to speak here. What brought me over to this country this time was really the celebrations of the anniversary of George C. Marshall. His seminal concept, of course, has changed for the better the destinies of my country and my generation of Europeans. In fact, it has changed the face of the earth and the fate of nations. Without a strong Atlantic alliance and a strong Western Europe, the annus mirabilis of 1990 could never have happened. And without the achievement of George Marshall, the Atlantic alliance and a strong Western Europe would not have taken shape in the first place. Coming from a major country in Europe and a close ally of the United States, and being also part of a generation that was fortunate enough to grow up and like a mid-Atlantic view on life and politics, I think I'm personally a witness to the fact that democratic leadership does matter in real life. Born on the day of the infamous Munich Conference, 1938, that was marred by the absence of the US from the European theater of pre-war, the first Americans I encountered were the ones eagerly awaited by my mother and grandmother, who preferred to be conquered by the Americans rather than liberated by the Russians. My first word of English was chocolate, chocolate. tossed at broadly smiling black GIs appearing to us kids like messengers from a different planet, but smiling all the same. And for them, no fraternization, the marching order of the troops, did certainly not mean letting us beg in vain. My first business venture, alas a failed one, also began with an American sergeant demanding baskets full of snails, but then the fellow never turned up to collect them, let alone pay for them. Later I came to Harvard and Princeton on a more serious note and experienced the American way of learning, and for more than a decade I did indeed serve as a member of the German Advisory Committee to the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and today I am on various American boards, among them the German Council of J.P. Morgan, which enhances my adult education beyond belief. Anyway, my generation of Europeans has found the US, mostly for the better, a powerful force in our lives. Without the United States deliberately defining itself as a European power and engaging strategically on the other side of the Great Water, perhaps to some extent against the grain of this country, our lives would have been utterly different, hostage probably to the bitterness of European history and the cynicism of Soviet domination. But if the US had not engaged, this country would be just not much more than the world's greatest island. It would not have won the Cold War, but it would probably still be on in a somewhat different form from the one we knew. Now, all of this was not to be. It is a dark scenario, thank God, not realized by history. It was not to be thanks to the fact that in the United States' national interest, Europe's destinies always ranked very high. In turn, the German national interest has always been to be part of the alliance, indispensable, reliable, and reasonably predictable. And this is what I'm going to talk about, and I shall do it in stages, from creation to defining crisis, from maturity to new and very different European order, as yet unexplored and untried. George Bush and Jim Baker will probably not be ranked as the world's greatest historians, but what they did in 1990, they did as if history had dictated their script. The United States, since modern Germany was invented, has always been on the side of German democracy and national self-determination. This was so in 1848, 150 years ago, when the United States was the only foreign power to formally recognize the provisional government of Germany in Frankfurt based on democratic elections and looked at with the deepest suspicion by all the European powers of the day. In 1918, it was President Wilson who pronounced his 14 points, of course, against the Central Powers, but also against Lenin's bid for world peace through world revolution, and in addition, also against the Entente's far-reaching plans to crush and divide Germany. The Weimar Republic, inside and outside, had few friends, the most prominent being the United States of America, trying to limit post-war financial chaos, in fact, trying to stabilize as far as possible the beleaguered republic, but not for long, because you cannot save a country against its own wishes. While the United States were inward-looking in the 1930s and preoccupied with Asia, World War II was beginning to loom over Europe. And it took not only Churchill's power of persuasion, but also Hitler's excesses to turn America once again towards a Europe-first strategy, so essential for post-war reconstruction in the face of Soviet expansionism. It's an interesting thought to think that the Americans would have said Asia first. It would have been a very different world once again. And probably Europe lost to the Soviet Empire. Now, this turn in American strategy took some time. US overall strategy was slow to take shape after the Second World War. Perhaps it was to some extent even forced upon the Truman administration after the uncertainties and after the wishful idealism of the previous administration that had culminated in the naive stratagems of Yalta and the abortive, in fact cynical, Declaration on Liberated Europe, which was signed even by the great Stalin, who must have had a good laugh. General Eisenhower called his wartime memoirs Crusade in Europe, ignoring that the Crusaders were allied to the twin brother and one-time ally of the monster the US were out to destroy. After VE Day, Germany was the object of the victor's wrath, and not much more than, as the Soviet tyrant put it at the Potsdam Conference, a geographic term. But this was not what Harry S. Truman wanted to have. He insisted in Potsdam that the object now to be administered and controlled and already partly carved up by the victors had to be defined, first of all, in clear legal terms. And this is how the concept of Germany within the borders of 1937, to be more exact, of the 31st of December 1937, came into being. A concept or a formula, a juridical concept, that was to last with enormous meaning until the night of 2nd to 3rd October 1990. Back to 1945, the British and Americans had to learn the hard way that it is not so much punishment, that it was not so much punishment that they had to mete out, but the reconstruction of a new Europe that they had to devise. It was either theirs or the Soviets. On 6 September 1946, Foreign Secretary Jim Burns in Stuttgart assured the German Länder authorities, as there was no central authority, the Länder authorities with a clear message to the Soviets that US troops would remain in Germany as long as they were needed. 15 months before, Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in a telegram to President Truman, had coined the phrase of the Iron Curtain that the Soviets had let down in front of their part in Europe, hiding to the West, to Western eyes, what was going on behind it. It is almost to the day, 50 years now, that President Truman, in a message to both houses of Congress, pronounced what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. It had two parts, both very important and very historical. First, that the US was now engaged in a vast struggle against a similar kind of totalitarianism to the one that had been defeated in World War II. The second part was that the US would now take over from the British Empire the burden of defending the Eastern Mediterranean, in particular Turkey and Greece, against Soviet subversion and aggression. At the same time, George F. Kennan, then Chief of Planning at the State Department, put it to the readers of Foreign Affairs that containment of Soviet expansionist tendencies, as he called it, was the essential condition for the reconstruction of a democratic Europe now in the balance. The conceptual framework that Kennan laid out was not military confrontation, that came later. The initial design was based on the idea that if the United States helped the Europeans to recover, and if the Atlantic nations put their house in order and stood firm, at some stage in the future, Soviet power would, as Kennan put it, mellow. Kennan closed his seminal article with a phrase that not only appealed to American idealism, but also revealed a deep sense of mission. He spoke of a certain gratitude to a providence which, by providing the American people with this implacable challenge, has made their entire security as a nation dependent on their pulling themselves together and accepting the responsibilities of moral and political leadership that history plainly intended them to bear. Although George F. Kennan, whom I admire deeply, would object to my saying so, but it could be summed up, this last phrase, thank God for an enemy. Much more practical in application was the Marshall Plan, soon to be named the European Recovery Program, springing not only from American pragmatism and strategic globalism, but also from a fair amount of enlightened self-interest. It took a group of inspiring leaders, wise men indeed, to think beyond the bitterness and misery of the post-war world, to provide the economic groundwork for the future transatlantic community, the monetary groundwork having already been laid at the Bretton Woods Conference, to win over the war-weary American people and to enact this vision in the face of stiff Soviet pressure, short of war. In this way, Germany was put back on the map of Europe, thanks both to American reconstruction and to Soviet expansionism. It was certainly not for the blue eyes of les beaux yeux des Allemands, the blue eyes of the Germans, that we were put back on the map. President Harry S. Truman gave the rationale, the strategic rationale indeed, in all of this when he said that without the territory between the Rhine and the Elbe, the defense of Western Europe would be nothing but a rearguard action on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. Initially, however, European security after World War II went through a phase of strategic disorientation and uncertainty. The Brussels Pact of 1948, today's Western European Union, in a slightly revised and widened version, was still backward-looking. Germany designed as the danger of the past and the threat of the future against which the Europeans had to stand together. However, at the same time, the Soviets, by blocking all access routes to Berlin, by the way, as a reaction to the introduction of the Deutschmark in Berlin, in West Berlin, they blocked all the access routes on land and on rivers and canals, and this forced the United States into a situation where they would either have to stand firm in Berlin, whether they liked it or not, or to forego any claim for that kind of leadership that, from Burns to Truman to Cannon, some great American leaders had proclaimed. What ensued was not only the airlift, die Luftbrücke, an unheard of technical masterpiece, very much in the American tradition of trying to transcend an untractable political problem by technological means, something absolutely admirable, instead of being caught in a vast confrontation or even in kind of strategic pessimism. It was the American can-do spirit that said, well, why not try an airlift? Well, it had never been tried before, so it was time to try it this time, and it worked. At the same time, much less registered in the annals of history was a fair amount of nuclear diplomacy, which probably helped to persuade the Soviets, especially Marshal Stalin, to come to a compromise. The Americans made it known that they had a few flying fortresses that could be used as nuclear platforms, and two of them were sent on a very conspicuously, widely advertised mission around the world, fueled in mid-air, so as to show Marshal Stalin that the Americans were able to reach a number of places in the Soviet Union. Of course, they didn't tell Marshal Stalin that the Americans had only 14 nuclear devices at the time, which would probably not have been enough to frighten Marshal Stalin out of his wits. But it was enough to persuade him that the time had come to find a compromise over Berlin. But it was not only through the strategic vision embodied in the Atlantic Alliance that leadership, direction, and structure were finally achieved. On the eve of the signing ceremony in Washington of the Atlantic Alliance, President Truman asked the foreign ministers of the future NATO partners to dinner, together with Foreign Secretary Dean Acheson. And he must have told them something like, there's nothing like a free dinner, because they received a lesson in realpolitik. Truman and Acheson pointed out that the West was now faced with a global threat from the Soviet Empire. And that was the reason for forging the future Atlantic Alliance. But the President added that it came with strings attached. Germany and Japan, the President pointed out, in their present situation were down, but they were certainly not out. Sooner or later, the Kremlin would be able and willing to make them an offer impossible to refuse. And Soviet power, combined with the reconstructed industrial might of those two countries, both Japan and Germany, would allow the Kremlin to control most of the world to the end of all days, reducing, of course, the United States, as Truman saw in his strategic vision, reducing the United States to a big island surrounded by 3 oceans, but of no meaning for the rest of the world. This was why, in return for American protection, the Europeans would have to co-opt Germany, the eagle's wings duly clipped, into the club of civilized nations, whether they liked it or not. And some of them distinctly disliked it. In addition, the strategic alliance would soon have to be underpinned by European economic integration, including what Truman still called the German Reich, obviously not believing that partition was forever. Thus, he brushed aside French demands pronounced by Minister Schuman, the man of the Schuman Plan and Schuman Plan fame. He brushed aside French demands for a neutral Germany and British demands for a socialist Germany, because Britain was then under Labour government, which was not keen to have a capitalist Germany reconstructed in the image of America, sort of outproducing and outperforming them on all the markets, which the British hadn't gained through the war, but which they needed for the post-war reconstruction. But Truman said a neutral Germany was not on because it would allow the Germans to tip the future balance of European power between East and West. And as far as the socialist Germany was concerned, he certainly had to tell the British Foreign Minister, Ernest Bevin, by the way, that the American taxpayer would not like to have to pay indefinitely for socialist experiments. In fact, modern Germany was largely reinvented by the United States of America, not a country, one could say, in search of a foreign policy, but the byproduct of American foreign policy in search of a country. And if you go through the old pages of the National Geographic in the 1950s, you find a number of issues almost entirely devoted to Germany. Germany at that time was presented as not only the model student of the American way of life, but also America reconstructed somewhere in Europe, from hell through purgatory to paradise. Now, it took 10 years for this kind of improvised, pragmatic alliance to come into its defining crisis. After World War II, both sides, the US and the Soviet Union, wanted the whole of Germany, no doubt. And thus, with it, they wanted the economic and geographic heart of Europe, reconstructed in their own image. Free enterprise on the one hand, Soviet communism on the other hand. But both sides had to realize that this could only be achieved at a terrible price, that of World War III, and they were wise enough not to test the situation. So they settled for what they had. But neither side did take this settlement as the last word of history. And so the first Berlin crisis, 1948 to 1949, became the defining moment of the Cold War, which had started. It's a very interesting, fascinating historical debate. Where did the Cold War start? And I have various things on offer, but I would say the defining moment was then finally the Berlin crisis, with all its environment of diplomacy, ideology, and nuclear brinkmanship. The Korean War, a little later, turned German rearmament from an abstract concept into practical necessity, and it gave Chancellor Konrad Adenauer the chance to translate the new rough geopolitics between East and West into substantial gains in status and power for his country. However, at the same time, during the 50s, the Soviets began to master nuclear weapons. They exploded the first nuclear device in 1949, followed by the hydrogen bomb in 1953, and they also were able to put the Sputnik into space, which revealed to the shocked American public that the Soviets were in control of ICBMs, which sent a terrible message to America. America was vulnerable for the first time in history, if you forget the 1912 to 1914 little British unpleasantness in this part of the world. For the first time in history, America was vulnerable. At that time, it was an open question where the Cold War would go. Would the Cold War turn into a shooting war, or would you find a modus vivendi? There was no master plan. There was no overall strategy at hand. And the world went through an experimental phase, starting with the Sputnik start in 1957 and ending with the establishment of the hotline in 1963. And this phase was fraught with danger. Having been a soldier in the Bundeswehr, in our artillery, I must say it really still runs down my spine a little coldly when I remember these days and nights of the crisis after August 13th, 1961. This crisis started with Khrushchev's Berlin ultimatum in November 1958, and it resulted in the building of the Berlin Wall. It was then, a year later, it was continued through the Soviet plan to deploy intermediary-range nuclear forces on the island of Cuba. The Soviets, in fact, tried to translate nuclear clout into a new map of the world, and also to state their claim to parity with the United States. In this situation, and step by step, extended deterrence, that is, extended from the American continent into Europe, was complemented by the policies of détente, détente being the child of fear and reason. In Germany and in the waters around Cuba, the world powers had looked into the abyss. They hated what they saw, because it was the ruin of their own future, the ruin of their own vision of themselves. And the alternative to nuclear Armageddon became nuclear arms control in the first place, a German settlement in the second place, and by and large acceptance of the status quo throughout Europe, while in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world the Cold War continued to be hot but limited. At that time, France departed from NATO's military integration, grumbling about US dominance and forging an independent nuclear deterrent to make sure that French interests would never again be ignored. And the French, of course, mumbled certain dates which have a great meaning to this present day, to every French politician, let alone soldier. One of these dates was 1920. Or let's start with 1914. The next one was 1920, 1940, 1945, 1956. And of those 5 dates, 3 were the responsibility of les Anglo-Saxons, who had left la pauvre France in the lurch, alone with the Germans and the Russians and other unpleasant people on the European continent. For the Germans, this way of assuring that their interests would never be trodden upon was impossible to do. The Germans were not open for any kind of nuclear production, or let alone possession. They had to find other ways. So while the French and the British, to some extent, in the special relationship, after 1956, opted for a national independent nuclear deterrent, that is, as the last line of defense for the national interest, the Germans had to bind their national interest entirely, unconditionally, to the United States of America. NATO countries, including, by the way, in political terms, France, settled then for the Harmel Report. Harmel was the name of the Belgian foreign minister who lent his name to work that was done by diplomats and soldiers in NATO. The Harmel Report stated that Western security in the future would have to have two pillars, deterrence and détente, and that gave reassurance to the Europeans that America would not ride roughshod over their interests, especially when driven by the demands of nuclear arms control. The Europeans in general, and Konrad Adenauer in particular, had this fear, which is still lurking in the back of some of our minds, that America, when it came to nuclear arms control, would sell down European interests. So you better make sure that there is a conceptual and diplomatic and strategic framework that this would be prevented. The Germans, without a nuclear option open to us, signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But Chancellor Adenauer insisted on nuclear participation, in fact, access to planning, targeting, and arms control. And this was accommodated in NATO's nuclear planning group, which gave and gives participation without allowing control. So Germany found herself in the strange situation of a country. In that respect, I think we were the only NATO country in that particular position. All NATO countries are different. Only today there's a mythology that there is kind of standard NATO membership, which is ridiculous, totally ahistorical, apolitical view. Germany's position was we owned, literally owned and operated nuclear platforms, big guns, starfighters and other things, without having nuclear weapons, just in case. It gave us something some chip in the great game. Franz Josef Strauss, above all, was one of the promoters of that idea, but he was pretty much alone, except for Helmut Schmidt, who understood the same ideas very well. Both of them students of Raymond Aron in France and Henry Kissinger in this country. Concomitantly, the Germans had to accept that the four powers came to a modus vivendi over Berlin in 1971, thus defining the one part which under no circumstances they would give into the hands of the Germans to make their own settlement. Berlin, in a way, the Berlin Agreement is a fascinating piece of diplomatic history. And it can only be recommended to people who want to have everything very clearly spelled out without contradictions, but with very clear definition. It was full of contradictions. The central object, namely the territory to which the treaty applied, could not even be defined. The relevant area, that was it. But it was a wonderful agreement. It worked very well. And it secured that neither West Germany nor East Germany could in any way interfere with Allies' rights over Berlin. Berlin was, until the night of the 2nd October 1990, the last part of the German Reich under Allied sovereignty. But it was not annexed, neither by Russia, Soviet Union, nor by America, nor by anybody else. It was the last part of the German Reich. Sovereignty had gone to the occupying powers, who, of course, as everybody knows, were divided about it. But they also had a common interest in keeping it that way, because it gave everybody, including the French, a share over the destinies of Central Europe. The French, the British, the Americans, and the Russians, they were all sovereign throughout the whole of Berlin, but the Russians only symbolically enacted that in the West, and the West only enacted it symbolically, that is through jeeps and an occasional visit, and no controls at the border, at the Sektorengrenze, but it had to be kept alive. And I think it was terribly important that it was done this way, because it forced not only the four powers into constant cooperation, it also forced the Germans into constant cooperation. Every time the East Germans or the West Germans would say, forget these bastards on the other side, we'll never again speak to them. We just cut the world in two parts. No, you couldn't do that, because what do you do about Berlin? The world had come twice close to war over Berlin, so you couldn't just sort of push it aside. The Germans then, after the Berlin Agreement of 1971, proceeded with their basic treaty, the Grundlagenvertrag of 1973. And this was the German contribution to détente, known under the name of Neue Ostpolitik and publicly associated with Willy Brandt's chancellorship. And this did indeed take out some of the insecurity and instability of the same geostrategic situation that had been the catalyst in 1948 of the Cold War, in 1961 of détente, and would be the catalyst in 1989 of a sea change in world affairs. All of this could not have been handled, could not have been controlled without the framework of NATO and without the strong stewardship of the United States. But, of course, Berlin was never part of NATO. Berlin was a masterpiece in extended deterrence, nuclear deterrence, but it was not part of NATO. So everybody who says now, well, we could, the eastern widening of NATO, handle like the Berlin situation, should read a little bit of history to understand that these things were more complex than many people thought at the time and think today. What followed was then the Helsinki Process through the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was meant by the Soviets to provide the nearest thing to an overall European settlement which would rubber stamp all their war and post-war gains throughout Europe. Instead, through the presence of the US, the Soviets were forced to accept, instead of one basket, three baskets. One on human rights, which they hated, but had to publish. One on trade, that they liked. And one on borders, which was fairly ambiguous. Yes, borders were inviolable, but they were changeable through democratic procedures. In the end, Soviet strategy turned against the Kremlin, and dissent throughout the empire of evil, as Ronald Reagan called the great adversary, found in Helsinki a moral base and a point of departure. Meanwhile, nuclear arms control, SALT I, SALT II, went ahead, but soon the alliance ran into the third great East-West confrontation, 1975, again over the face and faith of Germany. This time, the Soviets began to deploy SS-20s, high-accuracy missiles tipped with 3 independently targeted warheads. It was high-class technology, impressing all of the Western experts very much. But it was not so much the technology that impressed us, it was also the political strategy that the Soviets perhaps hadn't intended, but we soon taught them that there was a political strategy in this, and the strategy was, as we understood it, the decoupling of European security from the US nuclear protection. Decoupling meaning that somehow Europe could be threatened without the United States being automatically drawn into the conflict. In Germany, the Greens and the peace movement rose, the SPD became very jittery, the Schmidt-Genscher government tottered and fell in 1982, and the new Kohl government, in the face of most of the media and overwhelming mass opinion and deep doubts, including in the Chancellor's party, forced through NATO's double-track decision. The deployment of American Pershings and cruise missiles was an act ever since 21st November 1983, was an act of defiance, and it was an act of leadership. Without it, the Soviets would not have had a reason to start negotiating seriously. Gorbachev would perhaps have continued the confrontation posture of his predecessors. The empire would have repaired its crumbling structures, and the map of Europe today would be as boring as it was for 40 years. What Helmut Kohl had said in his first Regierungserklärung, his government program in October 1982, that the strength of the alliance was an essential part of Germany's national interest, in 1990 finally got a meaning far beyond anybody's expectation at that time. And with this, of course, I now turn to the question of what's happening today. German unification was both an ending and a beginning. An ending to the Cold War in Europe that had started in Berlin and came to a close in Berlin. An ending also to the outer empire of the Soviet Union, to be followed by the implosion of the inner empire. None of this drama fraught with strategic uncertainty. In fact, the danger of a big war loomed very large. Could have been contained and controlled without the Atlantic Alliance, and the Germans, situated center stage, would have had a very hard time without the reassurance coming from the United States. It was, in a way, a faint resemblance to 1848. The Europeans uneasily watching democratic Germany groping its way, and only the United States saying, go all the way, we'll be on your side. And we'll make sure that NATO stays in one piece. In addition, the vast structures of arms control and confidence and security building measures did also contribute decisively, because they set a very high price on any forward flight or attempt on the Soviet side to stop the world. Indeed, the tectonic shockwaves took place where days or weeks or months before any step across the border between the two Germanys could have unleashed catastrophe. Philip Zalikoff and Condoleezza Rice have in their magisterial analysis shown in great detail, based on government sources, the strategy that led, as the title of their book indicates, to results that changed the face of the earth. Germany unified and Europe transformed, a study in statecraft. Among all the powers, the United States was foremost in insisting against the Soviet pressure, without any wavering, that the answer to this crisis could only be democratic unification of Germany, and that this would have to happen inside NATO, and of course that time was of the essence. There were very many people who thought, well, give us 5 years' time, then the East Germans may find their identity. I would add that in 5 years' time, most of the East Germans would have found themselves in West Germany for very clear reasons. And in 5 years, because of course the Soviet Union would have crumbled, the German question would have been a really loose cannon on deck, and the world would have been a very dangerous place. Time was of the essence. There was a happy configuration of leaders, understanding the dangers, but even more understanding the challenges and promises inherent in the falling of the Berlin Wall. Without the firm and inspired leadership coming from this part of the world, including the 10 points in the Caucasus that were prefigured by the 10 points Baker had made 5-6 months before, the process would have lasted much longer and might have gone dangerously astray. It has to be remembered that all of this happened while the Soviet structures were already falling apart, and the power play in the Kremlin between the reformers and defenders of the old thinking was a very open contest, with stakes sky high. There were, after all, still more than 400,000 crack troops in Eastern Germany, not to speak of the various satellite armies all around. While some European leaders, in spite of many decades of their alliance with Germany and dutiful lip service to their heartfelt wish to see Germany reunited as soon as possible, some of these leaders came out of the 19th century, and it was once again the US who took the long view on Germany and Europe. This was not only optimism versus pessimism, it was also trust and democratic vision versus fear of the old demons. And I'm not saying that this fear of the old demons was not in many ways a justified one. You only have to look at Yugoslavia, what happened there. There the old demons really got out of control, and we should have been much more pessimistic about Yugoslavia than we were. because it took us too long to see and to understand that this was for real. Only weeks before the wall had come down, Jacques Delors, then the president of the European Commission, had made it clear that the East Germans had a legitimate place in the European Union. He worded it that way. He didn't say East Germany had a legitimate place. He said the East Germans have a legitimate place. He didn't even say the citizens of East Germany, because in our concept that wasn't really a country with citizens, but a dictatorship with subjects. And the fact that European integration had progressed so far certainly helped to lay to rest many fears of a Fourth Reich or a quatrième empire. Even more important was NATO busily redesigning its nuclear posture, redeploying its forward-based forces, and engaging in enhanced confidence and security-building measures. But there was also the insight on the Soviet side that Germany safely integrated in NATO was better than Germany united and in a kind of key position within the European system. Without working hand in glove with the US side, the German Chancellor, the London Economist called him Wunderkohl, could not have put the loose ends together at Mineralny Vody in the foothills of the Caucasus. Since then, the world is a different place. In Europe, NATO has changed almost beyond recognition from a Cold War alliance to contain Soviet expansionism into a crisis management and conflict-stopping venture. Meanwhile, the opening of NATO towards those Europeans now coming in from the cold is underway. But it is impossible to tell at this point in time whether this will result in a stronger NATO, a hollow NATO, or a NATO with Russia as either a fierce opponent or a Russia with veto power. No amount of paper signed can at the present time assure that the NATO of the future is the NATO we want and indeed continue to need, to some extent against Russia if the chill peace turns chillier still, or with Russia in order to manage the vast security agenda the West shares with the former opponent, from non-proliferation to persuading China to behave, from crisis prevention to arms control. In a way, we probably have to learn what our forefathers always knew, that, as Palmerston put it, great countries have no permanent foes or friends, they only have permanent interests, which may not be today's order of the day, but inherent in this word of Palmerston, or Bismarck said the same things, is of course the notion that you have to handle Russia with great respect, without this false sentimentality that the Russians are now wonderful people and our great friends, but also without the wrong simplification that the Russians haven't changed, that they are still very wicked people, etc., etc. We have to have a very balanced view, taking into account the unpredictability of the present Russia, compared to which the Weimar Republic looks really like a kindergarten outing. Russia in this chaotic state in which it is, where things are not very well improving, with anything between 15 and 30,000 nuclear missiles thrown in, that is not a very comfortable neighborhood for nobody, whether you are very close, as the Germans are, or very far away, as the Americans are. So we have to have a kind of constructive ambivalence towards Russia, and to handle NATO widening with this in mind is an awful, daunting task. I think it can be done, but it needs more continuity and a very realistic and balanced approach than we have produced so far. In this context, it should by no means be overlooked that highest on the list of US national interests, at least as far as I read all these studies on what is the national interest of the United States, highest on that list is the protection of the continental United States against nuclear attack. In this world where anti-ballistic defenses are still experimental, this can only be done in close cooperation with the same Russia that may not soon learn to love NATO expansion. There is indeed a potential transatlantic clash of interests, and it should be identified, should be classified in time, and it should be laid to rest. Last but by no means least, the Europeans will have to make an effort to think global, which they don't do and don't like to do, and the Americans, once again, have to make an effort to think European. Maybe the lasting impact of Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations will be that it convinces the Americans that in spite of all the Pacific rims of the world, there's only one civilization fairly similar to theirs, and that is to be found in Europe, while the Europeans should remember the same ultimate truth. Europe may look like a part of the vast Eurasian continent, but in fact it is only a small coastal strip, a small peninsula, and its security depends, and that is the great lesson of the 20th century, on the firm alliance between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean and the indivisibility of freedom. But to give reality to such concepts, it is high time that allies divided over many global issues get their act together. And this goes for both the United States and the Europeans. It is all very well that the Europeans put their common foreign and security policy into the paper of Maastricht, but the follow-up was next to zero. It's a tragic caricature. What we see, we fell apart even at the moment of the signing ceremony over Yugoslavia, over the Gulf, over anything that mattered. It's a vast paper-producing machinery agreeing on such innocent things like human rights for all the world, but not agreeing on the really hard and tough issues. The most important issues on which both sides tend to differ is probably the power play of the greater Middle East, and that is a very serious and very pressing business, especially now that the peace process seems to be in a kind of agony. The second issue closely related to the Middle Eastern problems is non-proliferation, and eventually the challenge even of counter-proliferation. The third issue is to develop and coordinate a policy to safeguard Western interests in the Far East. The most likely crisis scenario in that part of the world would be the merger of North and South Korea. And this will not take place in anything like NATO or the European Union. There is no arms control system of any kind in place. It will happen where power is in a raw and largely uncontrolled state, and it will not happen very long away. It will be the greatest test of US leadership, even more than 1990, and of European cooperation and European nerve. For Germany, it is and remains an academic question whether the European Union is more important or NATO. I personally would say NATO is more important. Both are vital to the national interest of Germany, and this national interest can be expressed in its simplest form through three wishes: to eat well, to sleep quietly, and never to be alone. To eat well means the European Union. It means WTO, wide open markets. Whether it also means the euro, there the German government and the German people are at odds with each other. To sleep quietly means an equitable social contract, and never to be alone. Perhaps the greatest of all lessons the Germans received in the 20th century is to be an indispensable ally of the United States of America. Throughout the past 300 years, whoever ran the show in Germany, whether the Austrian emperor or the Prussian king, whether William II or Stresemann, whether Adenauer or Helmut Kohl, was well advised to be on good terms with the balancer from beyond the sea. Britain until the end of the 19th century, the United States since World War I. Today, Germany is a close ally of the United States. The people, including those in the East, like and admire America. On this side of the water, Germany is seen no longer as the enemy nation. We figured as enemy nations, still do, in the United Nations Charter. And the strange irony of this was that some Germans complained and said this must be taken out of it, but the more enlightened Germans said, no, no, leave it in the United Nations Charter for a very almost absurd but convincing reason. This is one of the few is a mentioning of the undivided Germany. What was meant was the Germany of 1941. So we did cling to that. By now it's a piece of history. Germany no longer the enemy nation, but a partner in world management. I'm not saying a partner in world leadership. That was left to George Bush, and the Germans looked a little distressed when it was thrown at them, and they didn't really know what to do with it. Partnership in leadership. At present, Germany is visibly preoccupied with a vast agenda to attend at home and with some economic readjustment to do, in fact, very serious readjustment. This, however, is a much better state of affairs than anybody could have dreamt up 50 years ago. And I think it is worth every effort to make our great alliance the centerpiece, once again, of world stability in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Only a seasoned historian could have provided us with that sweep, and so vividly reminded us also of a period that for many Americans seems like ancient history, and yet quite properly we're reminded is a part of the piece of the present. I should also thank the Marshall Foundation as well, which I neglected to do earlier, for indeed being the sponsor of Professor Stuermer's visit to the United States. And all of us, I think, are especially proud of that particular act in foreign policy, where there was a happy coincidence between our clear-cut, enlightened self-interest and what was as well a humanitarian policy, one of those few moments where the two can coincide so well. And it certainly in turn reminds us of the great genius and intelligence of a foreign policy that was molded over a relatively short period of time in the late 1940s and 1950s, a great chapter in American diplomatic history. But I would like to close the evening by thanking Professor Stuermer for sharing his wisdom with us. It's enjoyable to focus upon Germany and its future, and extraordinarily important. Thank you very much.